All right, while the last lapel mic is being put on, I'm really excited to introduce this final plenary of the first day of the forum. The title of this plenary is Remembrance and Decolonisation. It will be a roundtable moderated by Maya Krishnan, a DPhil candidate in philosophy, with 5 speakers, our largest in this forum. Jess Auerbach, who's a visiting researcher at the Open University of Mauritius, Gurminder, Bhambra, who is professor of Postcolonial and Decolonial studies at the University of Sussex, Olivia Durand, who is the co-director of Uncomfortable Oxford, Hazim Hardeman, who is an MPhil candidate in US history here at Oxford, and Morategi Kale, who is DPhil candidate in geography and the environment at the University of Oxford. Please give them a round of applause.
So I'd like to thank all of you for joining us for the last panel of the day on remembrance and decolonization. We're envisioning this as a conversation among the panelists that's going to open up to include the audience. The initial focus might be a little bit more on decolonization than on remembrance, but I would certainly welcome anyone to bring this up later on if they like. So when brainstorming for the event, we found that there were a lot of different meanings that might be attached to that very important but sometimes rather slippery term, decolonization. So for the opening remarks, I've asked each participant to think about what they mean by decolonization when they use that term. And Hazim, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Maya. So by way of introduction, what I want to think about is a couple of things. One, there was a recent tweet on Twitter by, not surprisingly, a former Rhodes Scholar, who I hope isn't here, because that'd be awkward. But the tweet read, "This generation will decolonize capitalism, period, discuss," right? And it really sort of brought into view this question around, what are the sort of limits of the elasticity of using decolonization as a sort of trope, right? And there's this really important text by scholars of indigeneity, Eve Tuck and K. Wang Yang, called Decolonization is Not a Metaphor. And in that text, what they're trying to do is grapple with the ways in which decolonization is used and also misused. And I thought a really interesting point to sort of dovetail this conversation was Professor Dorling's remarks when he suggested that one way Oxford might be sort of decolonized is to turn on the cameras, right, and make knowledge more accessible to the community outside of Oxford. But I wanted to sort of challenge that in an effort to think about what do we mean when we say sort of decolonize, right? What does it mean to sort of decolonize Oxford or decolonize methodology or decolonize our mind? And I think one of the trepidations we should have is, in this instance, for example, part of what decolonization means is to recognize how decolonization is incommensurable with certain broader efforts that we might understand as a push to make something more equitable or more accessible, right? So in that particular example, I think one of the things we have to reckon with is the fact that part of the process of settler colonialism is not only enclosure, but foreclosure. And what does that mean for this example? Well, for me, what that means is that the process of colonialism, one of the constitutive elements is that knowledge will be hidden behind various walls, but also that the horizons of those knowledge will be shaped by sort of colonialist ideologies in a way that foreclose on our imaginations, right? So this idea of sort of turning on the cameras and making this space more accessible, how does that make sense within a realm of decolonization? And how might that get us to think about the ways in which decolonization is something very particular and not synonymous with any generalized efforts to make society better in which way we imagine?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Oh, yeah. Okay, so, I mean, I wrote everything down, otherwise I get too nervous and forget. But I think I want to start by saying, I want to talk about a little bit about decolonization as practice, and I want to start by saying that I am in no way an expert on decolonial theory and decolonization. But in my research and what I try to do is I am trying to become, I guess, an expert on young people. And why I like to study young people is for 2 reasons. I think empirically, young people, understanding young people gives us a lens through which to understand a range of issues like class, social mobility, politics, the labor market. And also conceptually, young people offer us a basis for reevaluating terms such as structure and agency, terms which form part of the intellectual currency of many issues in the humanities and the social sciences. So in my talk, I'm going to come back to young people in a second. But answering the question of what comes to mind when I think about decolonization, I mean, besides feeling incredibly overwhelmed, just because, colonization affects so many facets of my life, I think two questions. The first one is, what does decolonization mean? And then the second question is, so what do we do to decolonize? And I think the first question is something that I've engaged a lot on in university campuses in South Africa and in the UK at Oxford. And we really do continue to engage on decolonial theory. And of course, what decolonization means is still very much up for debate, but it's an area in which we do a lot of work in. But I think, in my experience, at least, what's missing is kind of the practice of how do we decolonize. And this is where I come back to young people and in my experiences of being on a university student, the University of Cape Town, from 2015 to 2017 when student protests were happening. And I think this is a point in which young people start to help us understand what it means to decolonize through their actions. And so fallism, broadly defined, is a movement that aims to decolonize. And I think Rose Must Fall, which was the first movement, aimed to dismantle colonial legacies of violence to Black people. And the Rhodes Statue was one of those kind of colonial legacies. And Fees Must Fall aimed to fight for free, quality, decolonized education. I think what's most inspiring about fallism is the ability of the movement to transcend theory for immediate and uncompromising action through a creative experimentation with theory, politics, and activism. And the result was that the Statue of Rhodes fell at UCT, that the fees kind of fell, and then there was the outsourcing, where the movement dismantled the outsourcing universities' blue-collar labor services, which maintain exploitative colonial relationships with organizations and Black labor, where labor is extracted with complete disregard for the welfare of those compelled to supply it. And also what the movement did was bring to our attention the utter falsity of the Rainbow Nation and the anomaly that Black people continue to live in South Africa as an economic and cultural minority in the land of their birth. So there's a lot that we can talk about in terms of fallism and its kind of benefits and disadvantages. But I really do think that it is the beginning in terms of understanding and talking about how do we decolonize. So now that I'm in the privileged position of having the time, the resources, and the access to do the thinking around decolonial theory, but also having been part of that fallist moment, or maybe it's not a moment, because I think it's continuing, and now thinking about what can we learn, what can I learn from that experience, what can we learn from that experience going forward, and putting into practice decolonization.
Thank you. Again, can everybody hear me? Yes, good. So in some way, I think that decolonial practices and critical thinking should make sense in the context of the approaches and the work that a humanities degree require, because we're thinking about a humanities forum. You have to think about also what humanities do, what kind of methods you learn, what kind of methods you develop within a humanities degree. And very often there is some disconnect between discussions and the practical impact of these discussions within the academic world, especially when we consider who is involved in those debates and what narratives they bring about. So I'm, as I was introduced, I'm the co-director of Uncomfortable Oxford, but I'm also myself a doctoral student in history. And throughout my doctoral studies in history, I kind of became increasingly aware of this disconnect and the gap that sometimes exists between good intentions and academic isolation. And quite often it has to do with some of the institutional barriers that make it more challenging to open up these discussions. And this includes kind of a fear of backlash. And in itself, the university structure also lacks opportunities to connect with a general audience on those discourses about decolonization. And it's very, very hard to kind of bridge the gap in between activism, academic world and actually the general public, and how we can involve them in those discussions and get them to be interested in decolonial discourses and debates on decolonization. So this leads me to a few questions. How do we remove academic and institutional barriers? What is the responsibility or imperative of academics to stimulate critical thinking, especially when it comes to decolonizing knowledge and systems of knowledge production? Most importantly, how do we involve non-academic, other valuable voices in these discussions, and how do we decolonize knowledge at a very practical day-to-day level? So I founded with another doctoral student here at Oxford, Paula Larson, Uncomfortable Oxford about a year ago. And the idea of Uncomfortable Oxford was to engage with the environment we live in, the environment we immediately interact with on a day-to-day basis, and bring up those narratives and trying to see how we can bring up decolonial discourses and just on the streets of Oxford at a very basic level. My own research has nothing to do with it specifically. It has to do with colonialism and expansion, but not linked to Oxford. And Uncomfortable Oxford mostly runs walking tours, and those tours recognize the historical presence of empire and violence and legacies of this violence in the city and in the University of Oxford. And the goal behind those tours is to stimulate discussions on the streets amongst participants about the modern legacies of imperialism and how we can see them in the cityscapes in which we walk on a day-to-day basis. And Oxford in itself obviously is kind of the perfect setting to do that, because at the university and as a city, it is a very potent setting for learning about historical legacies of inequality, violence, imperialism. It has this it is actually a very good place to start having those discussions with a wider public. And ultimately, when I think about decolonial practices and how I'm learning to do it and how we can do it more and more in kind of increasing the range of people who engage in those discourses and how they can learn to engage in those discussions about decolonization, it would be to actually see how we can have a more practical approach to those discourses and how we can actually give those questions, those viewpoints to other people to then go on and be interested in discussions about decolonization, be interested in history and how it impacts the world we live in today.
So when I'm sort of think about decolonization and think about what it means to talk about decolonization as an academic, one of the issues that is there strongly for me is the idea of what do we need to do to decolonize epistemology? That is the politics of knowledge production itself. Because in a way, the world that is shaped, or the world is shaped by the knowledges that are produced and legitimated within universities. And if universities don't take responsibility for the knowledges that they produce and legitimate, then that's part of the problem that is being sought to be addressed by the various movements that have emerged over the last few years. So I want to pick up on thinking about the issue of decolonization and remembrance to some extent, because it's precisely in what we remember and who we remember, and conversely, obviously, who we forget and what we forget, that shapes our sense of who we understand ourselves to be, and also shapes contemporary politics. So those of you with any familiarity with British politics at the moment will understand quite clearly how the failure to understand Britain's past as an empire is central to the dismantling of any semblance of politics that's going on presently. But what that also points to, for me, is the aspect how there is no institution within Britain that is not funded by the plunder of empire. And yet the failure to examine the ways in which the wealth of empire has been used to fund every single social and political institution is partly what creates the problematic debates now about who has legitimacy in terms of being here and who doesn't. So it's not that we need to have better histories in order to have better histories because it's better to have better histories, but actually having more adequate histories enables us to have a politics that's much more effective and equitable in the present. And if what we say we're interested in is in terms of addressing issues of inequality and injustice in the present, then the only way we can really intervene in these sorts of debates is having a much clearer sense of who we are and how we've come to be here. So I just want to give you one example in relation to that, because when discussing the history of British Empire, one of the things that comes up very often is that as soon as slavery is mentioned, the key issue that's put forward is, oh, but we abolished slavery. And it's like, great, Britain did abolish slavery after 200 years of benefiting from it. And at the very point that Britain abolished slavery, it replaced the triangular trade with the circle of indenture that took people from China and India and distributed them around the world in very similar sorts of conditions. At the same time as doing that, it did also give compensation. But the compensation was not to those who had been enslaved. The compensation was to those who had owned other people and traded in other people. Why? Well, because as a liberal democracy, one of the fundamental aspects of who we are is that we respect private property. Now, given that these people, when they were enslaved, were understood as property, to abolish slavery was to take property away from people, and you can't do that without compensating those who then lose that property. And so what did the British government do? It voted to compensate people who had owned other people, and it did that to a tune of £20 million in the 1830s. In today's money, David Draper has argued that it would be the equivalent of, I think it's Nicholas Draper, sorry. It would be the equivalent of around £65 billion, or 40% of GDP. And so when we have conversations in the present about reparations for Britain's colonial past, one of the arguments that often gets put forward is, oh, but we don't have the money to be able to pay the amount of reparations that would be necessary, because in terms of the wealth that Britain took from India, Utsa Patnaik has recently calculated that it was over $45 trillion was taken from India to Britain over the 200 years of British rule. And so if there was to be any reparation for that, everybody's like, oh, well, where's the money going to come from? Well, in 1830s, there wasn't enough money to pay the people who had owned other people. And so what the government did was take out bonds. And those bonds were then repaid over the next 200 years. If any of you have paid tax in Britain prior to 2015, you paid taxes to the repaying of those bonds that were initially raised in the 1830s to compensate slave owners. And that wasn't just if you paid taxes in Britain, but if you paid taxes across the British Empire, your taxes went to compensate that population. So if we don't understand that, we're not going to really understand who we are in the present. And so for me, decolonisation has to be about decolonising Britain and decolonising Europe, because the one part of the world that hasn't actually taken on the need to decolonise itself is the part of the world that colonised the rest of the world. We were talking earlier about how in every colonised country there are holidays, independence holidays or holidays to do with the Day of the Republic and so on. Britain doesn't mark its colonial past at all, and that asymmetry, I think, needs to be addressed in any move to decolonisation.
Thanks. So that's a really nice place to carry on from. I'm coming at this question from the experience of somebody who has tried to do something very different with the curriculum. I was part of a team that founded a social science program that took place, was located in Mauritius with students from all across the continent, where we tried to really tackle some of the questions that had led to the movements and calls for decoloniality, especially in South Africa. We got a lot of traction with our curriculum, and I want to acknowledge that 2 of the students are sitting in the room. One's now at LSE and one's at Cambridge, so Onia and Amina can give you different perspectives as well on these questions. But what we tried to do was a kind of curriculum that was based around dignity and around ensuring that our students felt that they had the right to contribute to conversations. Because to the question that Nangela asked earlier, and that wasn't really addressed today so far, why do we not have more voices in the humanities and in the social sciences who come from different kinds of backgrounds? And one of the things we were trying to do in our curriculum was make sure that students themselves, who came often from socioeconomically marginal spaces in the world, felt that they had the right to contribute and to be listened to and to be heard in these sorts of spaces. But what we failed to consider was that the institution we were operating in was very much a part of a neoliberal framework of power that did not want to have these questions asked and did not want to have the kinds of challenges that our students and ourselves were making placed front and center. And ultimately, the students were referred to as quote-unquote failed prototypes, and the sort of institution took a shift, which makes sense on many levels, towards a different kind of model of pedagogy. And our entire team left because it wasn't possible to ask these questions because people weren't willing to give up any kind of power. And so when we talk about countries that haven't addressed the long-term benefits, I think we also need to speak about the systems that have kind of come to circle the world. And is the answer to these questions just add diversity or just add a few more Africans into the 1%? Or is the answer to really rethink the systems? And we really felt that that was where we needed to start. And for me, the questions I'm really left with is, what are we willing to give up? Because the minute we have more diverse voices in the room, the less significant places like Oxford become, arguably. And the more that we bring different kinds of conversation onto the table, the less space there is for the traditional canons that many of us have been schooled to protect. And that's not to say that these canons shouldn't exist, but just what does diversity really mean? Well, it means loving people and caring for people in a very human, very deep, and very radical way, who may be extremely different to ourselves in the sort of sense of ourselves being here, this incredibly privileged group of people who are in the room now. And so that's I think maybe we're starting discussion. Thanks.
Great. Well, so my next question was actually going to be about decolonizing curricula, but I think the discussion has somewhat organically moved there. And so, I mean, then maybe what I would next ask has to do with getting a bit more concrete about what a decolonized curriculum might look like. I mean, I think there's been some suggestion that, okay, I mean, maybe a first step is to add more authors, maybe add a module, but I mean, I think as the phrase, decolonize epistemology suggests, this might not be far-reaching enough. So I'd like to invite any of our panelists to, say a bit more about what they think a decolonized curriculum sort of concretely might involve, either in general or with respect to the disciplines that they have the most experience with. You can go in any order that you like.
I'll answer, but I wanted to respond to, or echo something that Professor Gurminder said, and thinking about this relationship between decolonization and remembrance, right? And it seems to me, apropos this discussion around sort of decolonizing the curriculum, right? Because in my discipline, history, it's a sort of rife site to think about some of these questions. You talked about, to sort of borrow a phrase from a book, the sort of intimacies of the four continents, right? And how these processes evidence a sort of continuity rather than a sort of fundamental rupture between processes of expropriation and exploitation, right? And I'm reminded of former scholar Stuart Hall's phrasing when he said English nationalism could hardly fail to exist if it truly acknowledged whose tea rotted British teeth and whose sugar ran through British blood, right? And the point he's making about, what he's talking about is a point about the sort of processes of commodification and exploitation that takes from one group and extracts their natural resources to fuel the consumption of the sort of what we call the global north, right? And part of that is a historical project around remembrance, right? How do we narrate these histories and talk about the sort of development of the world as we've come to know
it? So I'll speak from the point of view of my field, which is history. And I think decolonizing the curriculum would be first, when we teach about colonial history or empire history, it shouldn't be an option. It should just be it is part of history. It's not just a side note or a side paragraph. It is actually something that should be a very much more comprehensive way of understanding history, and maybe it has to do with the trend to go a little bit beyond national narratives, to kind of think more globally about the connections that are created over time across different regions of the world, and how no country exists and no national history exists in isolation from the other, like their neighbors and further spaces. Another way to decolonize the curriculum should be, I think, just because not everybody has this privilege to go to the university, to start just a lot earlier to think about how we teach history in secondary schools. What is the history that is being taught? And again, because the way history is taught in secondary school, there's always this kind of pressure of exams on teenagers. There should be a way to very much look at the impact of this history on the way they live today, looking at the connections between, let's say, talking about the Crusades and how it actually started to feed a need for goods that were being sold by traders coming from India and from other countries in Asia, and how all those things are very much interconnected. So yeah, I think at two levels. First, not making colonial history an option, and then just starting much earlier, because most people don't get to ever learn about it if they don't choose history or get the chance to go to university.
When I first started teaching, my first permanent job, I was asked to teach a module called Modernity and Globalization. I had just written and published a book called Rethinking Modernity, and which countered everything that I was then being asked to teach in the modernity module. And so as a new lecturer, the course starts in a month's time. The question is, how do you then begin to change the modules in order to be truthful to the research that you've done and also be aware of what students need and so on. So the first year I did this, I sort of taught the standard arguments around modernity, and then in the second half of the term, I taught the critique of modernity. And I thought that went fine, except when I got the exams and the essays, they were all, modernity is a European invention, even though we'd spent the second half of the module saying modernity was a colonial invention, not a European invention. And so that didn't work. So then the next year what I did, I paired them. So I would teach the Industrial Revolution with colonialism. I would teach the French Revolution with the Haitian Revolution, and so on. And still, in the exams and essays, it was always modernity is a European phenomenon. And so it's like I spent the whole term presenting the arguments to them about the ways in which modernity emerges out of colonial imbrications. How is it that as soon as it comes to writing the exams, all that they remember is this idea of modernity as a European invention? And then there was a sense that, well, actually, everything in their everyday life tells them that. Because they don't get knowledge just from university. They get knowledge from the films they watch, from the TV they watch, from the newspapers they read. Everything in everyday life says that the modern world emerges in Europe and then spreads around the rest of the world. So then I sort of decided that I would rethink the module even more fundamentally, and then it turned into a module called Race and the Making of the Modern World. And we started with dispossession, appropriation, enslavement, colonization, talked about famines, and then talked about the way in which the modern world has been configured by these particular processes. So in a sense, it was like, forget about the standard and the critique. Start from the position that the critique is the norm. If you start from that, you open up the space for an incredible exploration of the topics from where you want to start from, and not think that that's where you need to end, but let's start from there.
Thank you. So for me, there's a very practical piece to this, and that is open access. I've taught at 3 universities that don't have libraries, that have a few books on a shelf where students are supposed to get their knowledge and subscribe to textbooks that cost hundreds and hundreds of pounds or dollars. And the more that we allow people to have to pay for high quality work, the more we force students in non-elite institutions to break the law. Because we all know that those texts are available on the Russian websites, and that it's not very difficult to download almost anything with the right torrent. But we then force students everywhere else that don't have access to Oxford libraries to do that and to become, in a sense, criminals of learning. And that's the only way that they can possibly, and that I can possibly in my current institution, access cutting-edge knowledge. You either have to have the confidence to send an email to an overworked professor to ask them to send the PDF of the book, or you have to find it on the web, in the dark web. And I think that the more that we acknowledge that those of us who are fortunate to work in institutions that support knowledge production, we're not getting money off our academic work. So why not just let it be in the internet? Why not argue very strongly for open access with our publishing companies? Because that really democratizes at least the edge of access to the ideas, even if the rest of that process is so much more complicated.
I just wanted to add something from my own personal experience in studying philosophy in my undergrad, and how kind of there was a call for more a diverse reading list, and for a university that's in Africa, more African philosophies. But what happened instead was that we kind of still learned all the traditional stuff, and then towards the end, they tried to add some more authors, but without ever even critiquing the philosophers that we learned about before. So it's not just about making the reading list more representative, but it's also about critiquing racist Kant and Eurocentric Marx and colorblind Rawls. And we have to say, read their work for what it is, and not this kind of argument of, well, can you separate the philosopher from their views?
Okay. So I wanted to just ask a question about the material conditions of decolonization. And so this is a question about how to think about the relationship between having resources and the kind of critical dialogue you need to engage in order to do decolonization. Some, although certainly not all, ways of engaging with that work can take a lot of financial and educational privilege as well as safety. And sometimes, although not always, this means that those undertaking the work of decolonization can find themselves imbricated within or dependent upon the very systems that they're trying to deconstruct. And so I'd just like to invite the panelists to reflect on either, when this happens, how can this be navigated, or how people interested in decolonization can seek out resources without playing a part in perpetuating the kinds of injustices that decolonizing is supposed to oppose.
I'll answer the rest of the question. I don't have an answer, but just wanting to emphasize the point that, you said that most but not all decolonizing work takes a lot of resources, and I think that kind of leads with the assumption that all the decolonizing work is done in these spaces, whereas a lot of it really isn't. And I think that's important to emphasize, that people are decolonizing every day, and that's one of the things that we need to do, is to acknowledge the work that people are doing outside of places like Oxford.
Just absolutely to echo that, because decolonization is not going to happen in the university, which doesn't mean that it doesn't also need to happen in the university, but this isn't the site for the sorts of processes that we're talking about. And if we're going to take seriously what was said at the very beginning about decolonization not being a metaphor, then we have to be careful that there is work that we need to do as students, scholars, academics within the institution, but it's not necessarily decolonizing work. And that might, you might sort of think, I edited a book with 2 colleagues called Decolonizing the University. And in the conversations with the publishers, I was like, I really don't want to call it that. I wanted to call it How to Make the University a Bit Better. But I don't think the publisher just wasn't happy with that, because that's the phrase. But ultimately, I think that the work that we do is about making the university a bit better. And if we can make it a bit better, then who knows what it can lead to ultimately. And what would make it better is to address the Black, Asian, and minority ethnic attainment gap. So within Britain, I don't know if you all know, but if as a Black, Asian, or minority ethnic student, you enter university on the same grades as white students, so this isn't that you enter with lower grades and so on, but you enter university on the same grades, you've got up to a 25% chance of leaving with a lower degree than your white student counterpart. So the only thing that explains that gap is what happens within the institution. So this isn't about racial hierarchies or inequalities within society that affect what happens within the university, because we're saying that when students enter on the same grades, BAME students leave with a 25% less chance of getting a good degree than their white students. And so that means that racial or racism is part of the institution, and all of us who are in that institution should be held accountable for allowing this sort of racial inequality not simply to be reproduced, but to be produced within our institutions. And for me, that's the materiality. That would be what making the university a bit better would be about, would be to eliminate the BAME attainment gap. And just to put it into perspective, there is no gender attainment gap. Men and women who enter university on the same grades leave with the same chance of a good degree. And there isn't a socioeconomic attainment gap. People from different socioeconomic backgrounds who enter on the same grades leave with the same chance of getting a good degree. The only gap that has been identified within the UK is a race gap. So what's that about? What are our institutions doing that produces this racial inequality?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, for me, there's a big piece here about self-transformation and about the willingness of everybody involved in these discourses to keep working on themselves. And so to keep expanding the sort of awareness and understanding of what and who and how are we human. And that involves canonical transformation as well, but canonical transformation won't happen if we don't read very seriously texts that others might not deem important. And within that process of really becoming curious and really taking seriously scholarly production that happens in other parts of the world. So take the 4,000 institutions of higher learning in Brazil, for example, that produce open access knowledge all the time, and that are largely ignored in the rest of the world because it's in Portuguese. And certainly in English-speaking academia, the idea of reading scholarly production that is not translated is quite surprising and quite puzzling a lot of the time. Whereas if you're a Brazilian academic, you have no choice but to read not only English, but also often French, and increasingly Mandarin. And I think that we need to really start thinking about the authenticity of our own transformation and how we do that and how we bring that into our teaching. And in addition, recognize that decolonization is becoming a bit of an intellectual fad. And like all intellectual fads, there is a possibility that the languaging itself will move on to something else. But at the same time, there's a need for the work to continue, and that this work itself is an iteration of a much longer history of kind of radical questioning of systems of power that is ongoing.
I quite liked your proposed title, How to Make the University a Little Bit Better, and I do agree that this is maybe something that we have to keep in mind when we are trying to apply decolonial practices in the way we're learning, producing knowledge, or teaching. And when we're discussing, we had a little chat before the roundtable, and someone mentioned that in the humanities in general, in the humanities section, there are at least up to last year, not sure about the numbers this year, there are only 5 students coming from the African continent in the humanities. So decolonization has also to do with who gets to go into the humanities and engage in those discourses, and how it still remains not very diverse, and it still stems from a certain socioeconomic background, and how we can overcome those challenges moving forward, thinking about how the university is shaping itself, accepting students as well. And at an individual standpoint, maybe we have to do a lot of self-evaluation when we engage in critical dialogue. We have to think about, where do I stand? What can I bring into the discussion? What am I lacking as well? Being very aware of the things that we are not able to do. So for instance, reading text in Portuguese and how it might affect what we're doing. And finally, also what things I should not say because it's not necessarily my place to say, and being able to be a little bit humble in the way we approach those discussions.
I have more of a question to my fellow panelists. one of the things we talked about beforehand was how do we have this conversation without allowing Indigenous people to slide out of the frame? And I think it's especially relevant if we're thinking about decolonization as the sort of repatriation of Indigenous land and life, right? And there's this way in which we can use it as a sort of sliding signifier to talk about making the university less racist or making it sort of more hospitable to students from the African continent. But what obligation do we have to Indigenous folk, right? The people who suffer under the thumb of decolonization. Of course, we all are harmed by its sort of corresponding logics, right? But colonization at its root is a process of native exploitation and expropriation. So my question would be sort of what obligation do we have to that, and how should that inform the actions that we take when we're talking about something like decolonizing a university?
If anyone else on the panel wants to speak to that? Okay.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And in that sense, it goes back to some of the things that have been raised earlier about the histories that we acknowledge and those that we don't, and to think about the very fact. So when I teach on race and the making of the modern world, and we think about issues of dispossession, it starts with the fact that the continent of the Americas has been formed through a process of settler colonization. And even Portuguese as the language of the Brazilians is a European language that is there precisely because of the processes of settler colonization, and that the US is not a nation, but an empire. And if you look at the history of what produces the US in the sense of it going from the 13 colonies across to the western seaboard, it's a process of extermination, genocide, elimination, dispossession, and appropriation. And that's the founding basis of that state, which then calls itself a nation and yet is a colonial empire. And that would be the same for Brazil, for Argentina, for Colombia, for Chile, for New Zealand, for South Africa, for Australia, and you could go on. So I think that aspect of how Indigenous peoples are located and displaced out of the histories that we recognize, and what would change in terms of the ways that we imagine who we are and what our own histories are about if we recognize that displacement and that elimination that is fundamental to the very possibility of our lives. So there is nothing about our lives that is possible without those histories. So what accountability do we have?
So yeah, I think these questions are so important, and something that I've noticed is becoming more common and really appreciative of is to acknowledge the people who lived in a space in which academic discourse or social discourse or corporate discourse is happening as a kind of given product of conversation, that we acknowledge where we are and who we are and how we are speaking in certain places. And that's a practical intervention that can do a lot to shift the way that publics perceive space. The second thing that I found quite helpful in teaching is to really make an explicit effort to teach with objects or with things that are not texts. And so, for example, that might be to start a history of the world with a plant that is indigenous or endemic to a particular area, or potentially with a piece of a form of art that might have existed in that space for a very long time. Because what that means then is you enter the discussion of global history without having to start with or reference colonialism. And that can be a very powerful intervention in students' experiences of canons, of learning, and of the right to speak. Because instead of saying we're going to start with the oppression and try to build up our place from there, you're saying I'm starting with a history of knowledge production that goes back thousands and thousands of years. But that somehow gets interrupted by this experience of colonial era text and literacy and missionization that has had a devastating effect on human forms throughout the colonized world.
For that, and also what you mentioned about the settler expansion of the US and many other nations, also maybe trying to see how we can fit the narratives and how those narratives can actually challenge histories of the nation. Because if you look at South American countries, if you look at British former settler colonies, you look at the United States, if you look at even Russia today, there's no idea of in general, like in public discourses about the nation. There is the revolution, the independence of these countries in South America. There is this kind of manifest destiny for the US. Russia seems to always have meant to be a continental empire, and those questions or those debates are still very much only slightly touched upon, and it could be very interesting to see how we can fit them within national narratives and how we could kind of break those national narratives apart a little bit more when we think about decolonization in contexts in which they are not normally applied.
So we only have a few minutes left, and I'd like to kind of open up the conversation at this point. And so we're going to do a few things in the Q&A. So one is that we're going to take 3 or 4 people at a time so that we can hear some more voices. And another is that I would certainly invite anyone who just has a comment or something they'd like to share that relates to this to, say their piece. There's no need to kind of try to really shoehorn it into a question, although you're welcome to ask a question as well. So, I mean, at this point, if anybody has either a question or something they'd like to say, so I'll take 3 or 4 hands at this point. I think there's one over there, one there, one there, one on the end, and
I'll just start while you're counting the questions, and lots of questions, I'm sure. Mine is more a comment. This is an exciting and challenging and good topic. My name's Rosanna, I'm from Canada. I'm settler Canadian. I work with a lot of Indigenous people. And I had a great experience living in the Northwest Territories. A roadie from there has started a land-based university. It's called Deshinta, a Center for Research and Learning. And it was a really important experience for me in my own process of decolonizing and unlearning. And it was very vulnerable. And I think something that's part of this conversation is the social support and psychological support needed around these kinds of conversations. And just to add a little bit of concrete detail, so this university is on the land on Yellowknife territory. You have to fly in on a float plane or skidoo in. Elders are the teachers. One of the first things Erin will say, right, is that there are tons of PhDs, they're on the land, and I think of it in my own life, right? There are the folks that haven't gone to university that would be PhDs in areas of their expertise. So right away, deconstructing those hierarchies, and then the learning, you're fishing, and then on the land, in story, in relation to the landscape, learning in a really different way. I just want to share and leave it at that, but thank you. I think it's an important and challenging and good conversation, and one where a lot of creativity is required.
And while I can also just see any further hands while, okay, thanks.
Hi, I'm Evelyn O'Callaghan. I teach at UWI in Barbados, and so I'm kind of struggling to deal with some of the generalizations that have been made here today, all day, and the figures that Gurminder gave us about the achievement of Black and Asian and so on students, because that's not the situation where I come from. And I'm sure it's not the situation in a lot of African universities, or indeed in a lot of Southern American universities, where the vast majority of students are Black or Indian or a mix of both or whatever. In fact, I mean, I haven't taught a white student for years, but anyway. I was also a little surprised that you used the term decolonization as opposed to referring to post-colonialization, because the good thing about post-colonial theory is that it actually acknowledges that colonialism is not done yet. Its presence is very much there in all of the institutions, as you said, in all of our histories. And the problem that I face at my university is that history is no longer a requirement in the secondary schools. So here you have people who are the product of colonialism, who came, all of them, the white, the Black, the Chinese, from somewhere else, and formed a new entity and wrote its own literature and developed its own history, and the kids aren't even learning it in high school because it's no longer mandatory. Back to STEM again. Anyway, I'm not going to rant on that. So what I do want to say is that in the absence of history and the formal teaching of every single child in the Caribbean about their history of colonialism, slavery, etc., and about emancipation and about rebellion, we should also make mandatory the teaching of Caribbean literature, because that provides everything you need to know. Frankly, I argue with the historians all the while. We can do your job, no problem, you know? And more, because Caribbean lit is our canon, and that is where we start. Nobody does Chaucer anymore. I mean, I think we've gone to the other extreme, because, you know, we're throwing out a lot of bathwater with the baby. No, the other way around, whatever. We're throwing out a lot of baby with the bathwater. And also when, oh, all right, I have to stop now. So I just wanted to say that. Think about other contexts than Britain or the USA. Think about making places where history is no longer taught. Think about the narratives of the literary canon of that particular place, because that teaches the lesson of who you are, where you came from, and where you can go. Thank you.
Thanks. And I think we'll take one more question. I think, was there one right here up in the front? Just one right in there. Thanks.
Hi, my name is One. My question will be on what practical ways do you have and how do we bridge the gap between the various actors in decoloniality? Because I'm getting to a point where I feel like we're going to be decolonizing curriculum or doing that, but essentially then you are addressing people that already have access to education, are going to school. So essentially, how do I translate the idea of decoloniality to my grandmother? And also, when you look at the Rhodes Must Fall thing, it was nice, yes, we had actual students putting their bodies on the line fighting, and then you have all these people coming in to write books and theorize, and I'm like, okay, how does the actual student on the ground benefit, or at the end of the day, take away something from the decolonization project, or are we just moving in a spiral of just, okay, we're decolonizing, okay, I go to Cambridge, yes, I'm in the system, I'm going to fight and do that, but then I still have to learn in all these colonial structures and get to be a legitimate person, getting a PhD, do all of that, and by that time I'm like, okay, how do I translate that to other people? So how do we bring different actors into play and still connect them and bridge that gap while still acknowledging that there are all these institutional problems, access and system that we have to be negotiating? I think, what practical steps would you guys have for a young black person going into Cambridge or Oxford or whatever? You still go into a room when you're the only black person and you're just yeah, so those kind of things we still have to negotiate. I don't know. That's my question.
Yeah, so would anybody like to? Yeah.
So I'm going to answer to the last question just because this is something that I think about a lot. How do we translate at a practical level this kind of literature we've read, this kind of learning we've benefited from, and how we can actually have a practical impact? And well, through what I started doing through Uncomfortable Oxford is we try to, so those are walking tours. Walking tours can seem very, it's for tourists. Tourists come to Oxford, they want to do walking tours, but actually walking tours are a very good way to engage people, because people sign up for those walking tours, they don't know each other. They might be with a friend, but they don't know each other. They might be students, they might be locals, they might be tourists, they all come with their own background, their own stories. If there are tourists from other countries, very often they'll come with their own perspectives on statues. Imagine you're coming from, say, the US or from Russia, you'll have different perspective on controversial statues. And the idea, I guess, you cannot lecture people on the street, they'll stop listening, and it's not impactful. What you can do is actually make them talk about those topics. So the way we try to approach it, and when it seems to have had some impact at least, is to try to raise questions and to make people leave those interventions with more questions than when they came on the tour. So it's not giving answers, actually giving questions and letting people go on their own kind of journey, trying to read and trying to learn a little bit more on those topics.
Sure, so I can take a crack at the post-colonization, decolonization question, but feel free to jump in. I mean, my understanding on that is that these words have histories in different spaces, and I'm not familiar with the space and the history of that terminology in the Caribbean. But I do know that in Southern Africa, post-colonization is avoided because it allows you to stop too quickly, whereas decolonization tends to be used to allow more of a deeper interrogation into systems of power that have remained in the structures of learning and thinking, and also of corporate action over the last 50, 60 years. I agree with you that teaching history is really, really important, and the Caribbean is certainly not the only place where history is no longer taught. I'm shocked that in almost all of the, well, in all of the 9 countries that I've lived in the years since leaving Oxford, history is no longer taught very well. But I do think that there's an onus on us as scholars and people committed to this life to communicate better, because people will listen to our stories if we can find the right platforms. And so, you know, in my own ethnographic writing, I'm thinking a lot about working with digital natives and putting my ethnographies on YouTube, because if that's the way that knowledge is expressed and understood right now, I really think we can't be snobby in saying, well, then I refuse to engage because that's for the masses. We really have to take seriously the modes of communication that very serious people are using all around the world, and be willing to tell our stories on those platforms as well as in peer-reviewed journals which are written for our friends.
So just, I mean, I thought when I had mentioned the statistics that I was referring to the UK, but apologies if I didn't make that clear. So the issues around the BME attainment gap is in relation to the UK. I think one of the other things that we need to be aware of is the fact that universities are often the last place to address the sorts of issues that are being talked about and discussed elsewhere. So it's not so much about how we can talk to them, but perhaps how we need to listen to what's going on. When I first started working on the Haitian Revolution, for example, one of the things that came up was, why does nobody know about the Haitian Revolution? Why is there such a silence about the Haitian Revolution? And the more research that I did on it, the more I realized that the silence was in the academy, because the Haitian Revolution was inspirational to other political activists. Bolivar went to Haiti and learnt some of the tactics of guerrilla warfare from the Haitian revolutionaries and took them back to South America. It was fundamental to the Harlem Renaissance. It was also something that was inspirational to Maori people who were struggling against European colonization in New Zealand, as Robbie Shilliam has written about. And so in a sense, if we're talking about the silence of the Haitian Revolution, it was actually us within institutions who weren't listening to what was going on outside. And so I think it's much less about what we necessarily have to say to others. And perhaps if we started from a position of listening and then thinking about what that might mean for how we need to change what it is that we're practicing, that would be one effective way of doing that.
I just wanted to say that on the attainment gap, even though the context is the UK and where, I mean, Black people are not the majority, I think that you'd find that something similar happens in South Africa where Black people are the majority. And I think the issue is not about the numbers, but rather what is happening in those universities. And I think the structures are similar pretty much across the board in that, at UCT, this is very anecdotal, I don't know if there's any data about it, but in just observing that, like, for example, class medalists in the lectures were white students in a majority Black country, that is not, why is that? And I think that you could, it applies, kind of works in the same way. And then also, I guess, on the question of kind of practical steps and how to help people now that we're in Oxford and we have these opportunities. But I'm also, I guess my intuition was just to say to take people who are not in these spaces, kind of take their voices seriously and be careful not to have this kind of savior mentality that now that we've got the opportunities and the knowledge that we know what to do for people. But I think, people who have never been to university and are not university students, practicing everyday politics and ways of decolonizing that maybe we don't have the language for, but it's happening. And so kind of just being aware that people are doing these things and maybe starting from that point rather than what can we do for people.
I think to answer the last question and a bit of the first one, as Maura alluded to, I think it's important to think about decolonization not as an event, but as a structure. And I think that's where the distinction becomes important, because though you can't say definitively either or, I think it's important to think about decolonization as a sort of activity that is born of the sort of everyday reproduction of colonialism itself, right? So to think about the sort of post-colony is to think about decolonization alongside the post-colony is to trouble the idea of the colony being post or the colony being a sort of afterthought, right? And in terms of thinking about some concrete things to do, I think one of the biggest things, and it speaks to also the first comment, is to not expect to get out of these institutions what we're looking for in terms of these processes, right? And in thinking about decolonization as a structure, part of that structure is to sort of play on the innocence and the politics of a sort of conciliatory politics that displaces the very sort of hard and necessary work in light of more easier work that only ends up reproducing a context that's predicated on native dispossession, right? So I think it's up to us in our sort of everyday lives, inside these institutions and outside of them, to enact various activities that disrupt those logics. So different ways of thinking about land, different ways of thinking about labor, different ways of thinking about community that actively go against those logics that we're trying to contest.
Great. Well, I think that's a good note to end on because we are at time. So I hope you all join me in thanking our panel.